That was Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. Welcome once again to tonight's show. It is Sunday, March 27th, and we're now a month into this terrible war in Ukraine. I'm Dmitry Alperovich, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitical think tank in Washington, D.C. Tonight, I'm joined once again by Michael Kofman, an expert on the Russian military and a research program director in the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis. And we're also glad to have with us today my good friend, Chris Krebs, co-founder of the cybersecurity consulting firm, Krebs Stamos Group, and of course, former founding director of CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We'll get to Mike and the substantial developments that we've seen this week in the war in a bit, but I want to first turn to Chris. Chris, first of all, I want to express my deep gratitude to Emily Krebs, who is definitely your much better half, for lending you to us tonight for a few minutes, because I know it's her birthday and we all wish her the most happiest of birthdays. I also hope the Room Raider team is not listening tonight, since they may ding you a point or two in the future if they hear you're missing your chief sets designer's birthday to do a Twitter space. But in all seriousness, let's turn to you, because we had a remarkable announcement from the President of the United States on Monday, warning the country that the Russians may indeed be interested in targeting our critical infrastructure sector through cyber attacks. And I personally have never seen an announcement like this from the President of the United States before on a cyber issue. And of course, we've been expecting the Russians to retaliate for these major sanctions and the economic pain that they're suffering. I've been thinking that they might attack energy sector and financial sector as well, potentially, in both Europe and the United States, to try to divide the alliance, to try to inflict pain on the economies of both continents, and try to cause political pain for President Biden and other European leaders. But you're working a lot right now with companies that have gotten these warnings, that have heard from Jen Easterly, the current director of CISA, about what they should be doing. Tell us a little bit about the types of conversations you're having and what you're advising your clients right now.
Hey, thanks, Dimitri, for having me on. And yes, Friday when you called me, I clearly was still in spring break mode down in Mexico. And when I accepted, not remembering at the time that Sunday was, in fact, Emily's birthday. So I think this was a notable week for three reasons. First, as you pointed out, President Biden's announcement about a potential incoming cyber activity due to evolving intelligence. The second was the Viasat, additional information on Viasat, and third is the indictments of Russian hackers for the 2017 through 2018-19 energy sector related activity. So back to your original question, companies are asking two things right now, primarily. First is for Western or domestic operations, what should they be thinking about, who's in the crosshairs? And like you and I have talked about for a while now, there's kind of two primary vectors to be thinking about. First is, are you on that potential list of down selected targets or target sectors that would make sense to a Russian actor? And right now, or at least a state actor, and I think that would be principally driven by prior activity or a tit for tat on where the sanctions are hitting hardest. And so prior activity is certainly energy sector. The Russians have been very interested for years in U.S. energy sector activity, and that kind of points back to the prior indictments from the fall that were unsealed this week. And then the second, on the tit for tat, where it's hitting them hardest, is in part in the financial services sector. So it's a lot of financial services sector organizations that are concerned about Russian activity. And then you think about defense industrial base and along those, and other government agencies. And there was a report of an FBI flash alert, TOP Amber, of course, but nonetheless found its way into the hands of I think it was Sean Lingus at CNN, and he reported on that. So yeah, I think that's kind of the primary concern target sets that we're hearing about. The second set of conversations that we're having is with organizations, and this is not a pure cyber play. It's more on sustaining or winding down operations in Russia. So Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, the professor at Yale School of Management, has this list. And the list right now is several hundred companies long. And it's divided into four different categories on a spectrum from have withdrawn entirely from Russia all the way down to our remaining operations in Russia. And that list is being maintained right now kind of as a public sector or public source, open source tracker of organizations. But it's also being operationalized by ESG groups, institutional investors, people that are trying to lead almost apartheid equivalent boycotts of companies for remaining. But the first three categories on that list are in some way, shape, or form, those companies are withdrawing operations, and there's certain IT operation considerations that go along with that process, both before you make an announcement and then after you make an announcement. And that includes backing up data, ensuring that any IT assets that are left behind are properly, either secured, bricked, or otherwise restricted access and limited only to those that operate in the state that remain in Russia. So that's a lot of the conversations that we're having. So it's not a pure cyber play. There is a good bit of insider risk piece there. That fourth group, though, that's on the Sonnenfeld list, they are having an entirely different set of conversations because they're potentially on a targeting list for Anonymous, the hacker or whatever we want to call them, the collective that is going after companies that are remaining. And we heard earlier this week that they had dropped, some large data set from Nestle, the European confection company, or whatever you want to call them. So that, there are a number of different assets or operators out there that have a diverse set of considerations and risks. And these organizations are trying to figure out what their exposure is. And then there's a kind of a final conversation, and one that you and I have also had before. I think a lot of organizations are kind of waking up, and they're saying, well, we've heard for the longest time about the necessity of factoring in geopolitical risk to our IT operations and cybersecurity risk management operations. And a lot of companies have kind of put it off. And so they're working overtime to figure out how to unwind Russia. And at the same time, they're looking forward and they're saying, well, wait a second, where are some other potential geopolitical flashpoints that we could be seeing pop up in the near future, or maybe even the midterm? And of course, the eyes immediately get drawn to China and the Taiwanese and the conflict with Taiwan. So that's a bit of a range of the discussions, at least we're having these days.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. So let me jump in first on the indictments because I thought they were fascinating. They indicted this Center for Scientific Research, Institute of Chemistry and Mechanics in Moscow, which is sort of almost an equivalent of our FFRDCs, federally funded research institutions like MITRE in Russia, works predominantly with the Ministry of Defense. And they were responsible for the so-called Triton attack on Saudi Arabian petroleum facility refinery back in 2017. And what was really interesting is that they targeted the safety systems made by Schneider Electric that is responsible from preventing things from going boom effectively in a refinery, looking at all the different industrial control processes that are taking place and making sure that if things get out of hand, that it can initiate an emergency shutdown of refinery operations. And they specifically targeted that system with their malicious code. And then we learned in the indictment that not only did they execute that attack in Saudi Arabia, but they were also targeting a variety of U.S. refineries in 2018 after that attack on Saudi Arabia, but they were unsuccessful in those attempts. So I think this gives us a little bit of a view in what Russia is capable of on the industrial control system side. Obviously, we've seen a lot of wiper attacks from them in recent years, both against Ukraine and obviously attacks that have escaped Ukraine like NotPetya. But this was a really remarkable attack that could have caused loss of life if that refinery had been, if the control processes in that refinery had gone out of standard operating procedure. So, Chris, again, let me ask you specifically. You work with a lot of companies right now. What are you telling them to do now? I assume if they haven't done anything before, it's probably too late to start working on your security. But if assuming that they've been paying attention to the Shields Up campaign from CISA, what else should they be doing given this warning, which was not a specific warning, of course, from the president? And my understanding is that we don't have specific intelligence on what may be targeted.
Well, through the consulting shop, Krebs Stamos Group, we released two different. We made it public, but two different alerts. First was what does Shields Up mean to a company that's trying to affect rapid change in a matter of hours or a couple days? And we pushed that out a couple weeks ago, and it's it starts at the top, really trying to get the attention of executive leadership, and that's what I appreciate, frankly, about the way that Jen Easterly and the CISA team have been engaging publicly, trying to not just focus on the technical community. And this is in part what we started at CISA a few years ago is, U.S. CERT had been pushing out bulletins and situation alerts constantly. But what we were finding is that there was diminishing returns, in part because we hadn't kind of prepped the battlefield at the leadership levels. So we made a bit of a change again a couple of years ago. So we started targeting more executive communications, and I see Jen continuing that in her outreach with CISA right now. We kind of took a similar model at KSG and tried to put out both the technical bits as well as the guidance for the executive leadership team and boards of directors. If you have a board of directors, otherwise down the stack, smaller companies. But it's unfortunately it's basics. It's basics like listen to your team, empower your team. Where some of those prior trade-offs, when you make decisions, are in favor of the business units or the line of business, let's tilt the benefit, the cost-benefit balance back towards the security teams. I know there's always risk in crash deploying MFA or insider risk tools, but if you're going to do it now, and push a multi-factor package as rapidly as you can across the organization, starting with those VIP or administrative accounts. So that was part of the Shields Up campaign. Again, we've got that public for KSG. There's a second piece that we did that goes back to that conversation about what it looks like. What are the recommendations that a company that's pulling out or making a business decision on Russia, what does that look like? And it starts with, you got to have your 24-hour controlled shutdown plan. And that again begins with, cutting off access to any global accounts, looking for any suspicious exfiltration, things like that, as well as you may not have 24 hours. What happens when the FSB shows up at your door and nationalizes the company? You need the ability to set, an unrevocable 1-hour shutdown plan. And the critical aspect of all of this is that whatever you're doing as an organization, you have to be making decisions in implementing the plan with as little operational involvement of the Russian team as possible. You don't want to implicate them down the road where they could have their own legal jeopardy. Try to keep them as pure and clean as possible.
Before I let you go, Chris, I want to run this by you. Assuming that there are cyber attacks that take place and they cause some damage to our economy, some damage to our infrastructure, the key question for the president and his national security team will be, how do we respond? And how do we avoid escalation in that response? The worst thing that we can do is get into a tit for tat with Russia that is going to be about who can destroy more of each other's critical infrastructure. That doesn't serve anyone. And there's high degree of escalation that it gets out of the cyber domain and gets into a kinetic conflict that we also, for obvious reasons, want to avoid with Russia. And I've been thinking a lot about this. And my view, I want to get your thoughts on this, is that it is important to send a signal, but a signal that does not do significant damage, at least permanent damage, to Russia in cyberspace, but shows what we're capable of, and letting them know that they need to cut this out. Because I do think that their view is this is, if they do launch these attacks, that this is a justified response to the choking off of the economy that we're engaged in right now. But we have to let them know that, no, this is not acceptable, and we can do massive damage well beyond what we've done till now with sanctions and sort of unilateral pullback from Western companies. But we have to send it as a warning signal as opposed to actually do it. So some of the ideas are like, turning off the internet in Russia for a few hours, which wouldn't have lasting effects, but can show you what you can do through cyber attacks, potentially denial of service attacks against core routers and things of that nature. I want to get your quick reaction to that. I know you have to run to do a birthday dinner with Emily, but any thoughts on that?
Well, I think what you pointed out is that whatever we would do back to them would be visible and reversible, and obviously limited in impact. And I tend to think that if Russia did anything here as a result of, again, the impact of sanctions, the continued lethal aid to Ukrainians, where Russia's obviously feeling some pain, I similarly think it would be visible, it would be reversible, with the clear implication of we can do more, knock it off, or we can do more. What I don't have a good sense of, oh no, Russian attack here, is how big of an event would they be looking at? And again, if you look back at the Sean Lingus reporting, apparently, there tends to be specific concern around potentially oil and natural gas, financial systems, services, and DIB. So I would probably look it back over and be thinking about what Cyber Command can do, what their capabilities are, what the intelligence community might be able to do, and we have a different value set. So I still tend to think that we would leave civilian infrastructure. We would be self-limiting, like we've been all along, but we would be self-limiting and leave civilian infrastructure off the table. I think we would focus on government or military infrastructure. So I think that would be a pretty, if it's depending on who pulls the trigger on the Russian side, FSB or GRU, assuming we have some sort of insight or some sort of understanding of what their command and control infrastructure is, who their officers are. I think we'd burn down their C2. I think we'd go directly to their leadership, very visible, apparent messaging. And I don't know if that includes extending an olive branch to try to pull people out on if there is in fact some discontent within the FSB. I tend to think that's where the response would be. I think we want to keep the impact on the Russian civilians as minimal as possible. But maybe that's, I'm just being an old sap, and I tend to think by the older rules of the game, and maybe the rules have changed.
I think they have, but we'll find out, or hopefully we won't. So thank you again, Chris. Thank you, Emily, for lending him to us for 15 minutes here. Really appreciate it, and go have a great dinner with your wife. Mike, let's turn it over to you, because we've had a really eventful week, in particular the last couple of days, when it comes to the developments in the war. On Friday, we had a remarkable briefing from the Ministry of Defense in Russia, where they articulated what their actual goals are in this campaign. My view, I assume you agree, is that those are much revised goals from what they may have been initially, but now they're saying, oh, never mind our attacks on Kiev and Sumy and Chernihiv and Kherson in the south and attempts to take Mykolaiv. That was all a feint. What we really wanted was just to take Donbass and to expand DNR and LNR, these statelets that we've created back in 2014, to their original borders of the regions that they had before 2014 when they were part of Ukraine. And that's all that we really wanted to do. And then we had today President Putin, in his address to the Rosgvardia on National Guard's Day, say that the troops of Rosgvardia are doing a special operation not in Ukraine, but in the Donbass. So clearly we have an attempt to find a path to some sort of declaration of victory that is still achievable on their side, and a scaling back of their original goals. First of all, do you agree with that? And do you think they will be successful in that attempt to scale everything back? Because I think there's a lot of puzzlement in Russia right now when the initial goals that they've declared of demilitarizing Ukraine, denazifying Ukraine, and suddenly you're going to be content with destroyed Mariupol and slightly larger DNR and LNR. Is that really going to be sold as a victory to the Russian public?
Thanks, Dmitry. Well, I think you probably remember a week ago I sort of theorized that they were going to stall out on two out of the three fronts in the north around Kiev and in the southwest around Mykolaiv, and that the only thing they had left to salvage was potentially an encirclement of Ukrainian forces in the joint forces operation around the Donbass, and that's what they were attempting to do. From the looks of it, that's where they were focusing. I'm not surprised at all by the MOD announcement. I think we're probably reading it a little bit too optimistically, saying that that's what it is, whereas most likely they're creating options for themselves in order to construct a narrative that this operation was solely about the Donbass, which is essentially what they said, because that's likely the one area that they can potentially still make gains and walk away salvaging something from this operation, given the way things are going for them on the ground militarily. But it's not clear that they've necessarily decided what they want to do. For example, there's a debate on the sort of the coast of Sea of Azov. What will they do with Kherson Oblast and part of Zaporizhia that they've occupied? Are those going to be trading ships? Will they potentially consider setting them up as republics and claiming this territory, partitioning Ukraine? My view of it is that Russian forces predictably became exhausted and combat ineffective as of about a week ago, right? I think that was anticipated. They don't have much in the way of offensive potential on most of these fronts. Ukraine has taken the advantage to pursue some counterattacks because they can see Russian units digging in. I think it's smart of them probably to pursue a counterattack where they can in the coming days, because any attempt to regain lost territory could be much harder and more costly in the future if Russian forces are able to fortify their positions. But yeah, I definitely think you see a revision of Russia's narrative overall, right? They're trying to give themselves an out. And I think the next 4 weeks or so, kind of timeline-wise, I don't want to put a specific marker there, but let's say this month, there are big political calls that the Russian leadership has to make about the future of this war. And I think we're going to find out more what kind of war this is going to be in the coming month.
So we're starting to get some signals that they may want to end this operation by May 9th. Of course, May 9th is Victory Day, one of the holiest, if you will, holidays in Russia, celebrating the victory in World War II, and a unifying holiday for all Russians. And since Putin has called this a denazification operation, he may want to try to tie himself to the World War II victory over the real Nazis, and declare that he has done this once again in Russian history. But do you think that even with all the propaganda that the Russian public is exposed to on television, that they will buy that all of this pain that they're now suffering economically and diplomatic isolation of Russia and so forth is worth it for just the Donbass region?
I mean, honestly, I don't know. I'm sure some people will buy it. I can imagine the way they're going to spin it potentially if they want an out later this month. They'll say that by taking Mariupol, they destroyed the base of the Azov regiment, which always gets trotted out in the Russian media, and say that they succeeded in denazification that way. And by striking Ukrainian military infrastructure and going after the defense industrial complex across the country, they'll claim that they also succeeded in demilitarizing or defanging Ukraine, and then essentially maybe calling it there. That's probably the narrative they're going to go with. But the big decisions to me are not about the May 9th parade. Okay, that might be an interesting marker. To me, the question is, what are they going to do in the coming weeks regarding conscript rotation, and are they going to conduct a national mobilization? Because the bulk of Russian military power in terms of the ground forces are in this fight. The fresh draft of conscripts comes in April 1st. They have to decide whether or not they're going to release conscripts that are currently in service, or if they're going to activate a stop-loss policy basically this month and hold on to those conscripts, which I think they will have to do if this war is going to drag on. Then after that, they're really going to have to go through a national mobilization if they want to find more manpower. And that manpower is not going to show up on the battlefield for probably several months afterwards, certainly not the new conscripts. So they're going to have big challenges sustaining this war. That's why I'm saying they're going to have to make a decision as to whether or not there's going to be a prolonged war of attrition, or if they're going to try to salvage what they can from this unsuccessful military operation and then try to bow out and spin a victory narrative by the end of April.
So do you think really they're running out of troops, because they seem to have a constant flow of Chechens coming in from Kadyrov. They still have troops in Tajikistan and Armenia, the so-called peacekeepers there that they could potentially bring in. You don't think that's enough?
That is a pretty small amount relative to the casualties they've taken. I mean, let's be honest. They're probably about somewhere between 120 and 130 BTGs into this war already. They don't have a lot more left in the standing force to throw in. Let's say another 15, 20 battalions they could throw in there. Then after that, there are big challenges for them. So they could scrape together some more forces. But look, after about a month worth of fighting, the Russian military's probably lost 25 battalions worth of equipment in this fight. It's pretty significant. Obviously not across the board. You can't kind of like linearly apply it to every part of the force. These fronts and fights have been fairly uneven in terms of impact on individual units. But nonetheless, it's quite significant. So the long story short is that the Russian military has considerable mobilization potential. It has a lot of equipment. They have access to manpower if they want to go that route, but it is a very significant political decision. That manpower, those units will not show up until months from now if they choose to go that route. And of course, none of it will be as good as the units they've already lost, because they've lost a lot of the best Russian units and the most elite infantry early on in this war.
And of course, if they mobilize and call up conscripts, not only will that be incredibly politically fraught, probably the most politically fraught decision Putin has taken in his presidency, but you also have to train these people. You can't just give them a rifle and send them into Ukraine. And presumably that training will take many months for them to be at all effective, right?
So, yeah, and if I can interject, the challenge with doing that is that then I definitely don't believe that they will be able to spin this as a war just for the Donbass and, Kherson. I'm not buying that story. So that is the direction in which they go. This is going to be a much more existential conflict that will have more maximalist war aims.
Yeah. So let's talk about the other part of Ukraine right now, because I'm curious. They made the announcement on Friday morning. Have you seen any pullback of forces from Kiev, from Chernihiv, from that western region yet? Which would make sense if that was just a feint and you were really advertising that Donbass is what you want, and perhaps you try to move those forces into that area. One, are you seeing that? And two, do you think that is something that they can execute, given that they are taking a lot of hits from Ukrainian forces right now? There's a number of counterattacks in those areas. Can they actually withdraw without losing a lot of people and sort of in a somewhat orderly fashion?
So I'm not really seeing them withdraw, although Ukrainian counterattacks are pushing them back, both around Kiev and a couple other places. Mykolaiv Oblast is now completely clear. They pushed Russian forces back to Kherson, and you've seen Ukrainian counterattacks around Sumy and around Kharkiv region, not far from Izum. But that said, okay, there's a bit of a catch-22 for the Russian military when we look at it from a strategy perspective, which is they cannot suddenly withdraw for two reasons. First, militarily, it will be problematic. They will then free up Ukrainian units to come down southeast and reinforce their positions in the Donbass, right? And Russian forces are trying to encircle those units. They're trying to turn the fight around Kiev and the fight down southwest into fronts where they're essentially pinning, or let's say fixing, Ukrainian units there so they can't come reinforce other positions. The second one is political. If they withdraw, Ukraine will declare a major victory over Russian forces, and it'll be a huge boost for Ukrainian morale and resolve. And I don't think they want to do that either. So my guess is that they will give up territory, try to consolidate positions, try to consolidate supply lines and logistics, probably retreat from Kiev somewhat while still keeping the city in danger, right? Or at least retaining the ability to pressure it, and then maintain those positions as long as they're fighting in the eastern part of the country. That's just one hypothesis.
Got it. And what about the involvement of Donbass? Let's say, Mariupol is obviously in a very, very tough position right now. They've taken most of that city already. and really destroyed it. Probably 80% of the infrastructure in the city is now decimated. But if it does fall ultimately and become sort of Ukraine Alamo, they'll free up those forces that have been used for the attack on Mariupol to try to do pincer maneuver up north and come down from Izum and envelop those Donbass forces. The Russians claim that the Ukrainians have about 50,000 forces in Donbass. Do you think the Russians can pull off such a pincer maneuver, given the problems that they've had with logistics? These are not insubstantial distances, obviously, and you have significant Ukrainian forces there. Do you think it's actually doable?
I mean, that's a hard question, Mitri. I always give disappointing answers such as it depends and war is highly contingent, right? So I think the honest answer is that if they take Mariupol, they will be able to free logistics for that fight and much better supply the forces pushing up from Melitopol and the southern end of this pincer movement. They're attempting a double envelopment. The distances between this double envelopment are pretty significant. I don't think they would be able to complete it in its entirety, but I think they definitely could put Ukrainian forces in a precarious position. I have to caveat that by saying I don't know necessarily what the combat effectiveness is of Russian units around Izum or around the southern part of Ukraine where you see that axis coming up from Melitopol. And second, I have even less knowledge or a notion about what the state of Ukrainian forces is in the Donbass. What their combat effectiveness is, how well supplied they are, and what their potential is to sustain this fight or to conduct any counteroffensives either. And we just have to be, I think, frank about that we have some idea about the state of Russian units, but it's very imperfect and incomplete, and the ranges are pretty far in terms of casualties and whatnot. And we have even less idea about the state of Ukrainian forces.
Yeah, and the Ukrainian forces, of course, are pretty dug in that area. They've been fighting there since 2014. Lots of trenches, lots of underground positions. So it won't be an easy fight to try to dislodge them. What about counterattacks, Mike? You mentioned that the Ukrainian forces have been able to push the Russians back near Kiev, near Mykolaiv. Do you think they can sustain that and actually push them further out, perhaps back to Chernobyl from the Kiev region, push them away from Kharkiv and Sumy, the cities in the north? What do you make of the ability of the Ukrainian forces right now to do that?
I mean, I think they can incrementally make gains and retake lost territory. Russian units are stretched pretty thin around Kharkiv and Sumy, for one, and there, I think there's advantages for Ukrainian forces. Plus, a lot of those units have been mauled over the past several weeks of fighting. Northeast of Kiev, there are issues for Russian forces because there's just a paucity of forces. There's low density. They're stretched pretty thin there as well. And they're pretty extended in terms of logistics supply lines. So you saw them retreat several dozen kilometers back from Bavary after a Ukrainian counterattack. Although at some point, those lines are going to consolidate. And then west of Kiev, if you look kind of at the positions Russian forces were taking, a bunch around the city, in Irpin, Bucha, and Hostomel, but then also an outer ring kind of facing outwards around Makariev and Borodyanka and the like. So there, Ukrainian forces have made some gains at that outer ring, pushing in from the west-northwest and crimping Russian positions. It's hard to say exactly what's happening there because, it's always difficult to reconcile claims. But it looks like Ukrainians are having some success with raids against Russian forces. That said, I can see the imperative of counterattacking now. While Russian units have lost the momentum, they're in an operational pause. They need to reorganize, replace losses, and it's best to attack them before they dig in. That makes sense. On the other hand, I'm not sure how well Ukraine can sustain a counteroffensive because that means probably leaving urban terrain, right, which strongly favors the defender, coming out in the open, engaging Russian units. You can do it where the correlation of forces favors you. But on the whole, I think Ukrainian forces also have to be cautious. They have to preserve their own equipment, manpower. And you can tell a little bit, at least, I don't like reading tea leaves, but you can tell from Zelensky's requests that they need equipment. They need more equipment to go on the counteroffensive, right? I suspect that their losses of equipment as a share of the overall force, which is quite smaller than that of the Russian army, are not insignificant.
Yeah. And, clearing Makariv is also very important for them because it helps them to resupply Kiev and clears up that major highway that goes from through Zhytomyr and into Western Ukraine. What about the Hostomel airport, the famous airport that near Kiev that was taken by the VDV, by the Russian airborne, in the initial hours of the war? They were thrown out of there. Then they drove through from Chernobyl and took it back, and they've been pretty dug in there. Have you seen them actually using that airport strategically? Do you think they're getting resupplied from the air into that airport, or is that just another defensive position for their ground forces?
No, I don't think so. I think Russian units have been using airports often as bases and staging areas pretty consistently throughout this conflict. It kind of makes sense in some ways logistically, but I've not seen them use the airport for substantial resupply. Air operations around there would be hard because there's still air defense functioning around the Ukrainian capital, right? And there's a plethora of man paths on this battlefield as well. So it would be pretty dangerous to do.
Yeah. And of course, we had Slovakia offering the S-300 system that it had back from the Soviet days. It said that it would provide that system to Ukraine as soon as it got a replacement. Well, last week it did get a replacement that is now operational, Patriot batteries that were driven from Germany. So presumably that system is on the way to Ukraine, or maybe is already operational there. And of course, Ukrainians had their own S-300s and other air defense systems that they could have used. One thing I'm curious, Mike, is if you sort of take them at their word that they're now trying to find a path to victory here with Donbass, the big question is going to be what to do with the southern areas, right? Because Mariupol, makes sense. It was originally part of the Donetsk region before 2014, so they can give it to the DNR and say this is yours, rightfully so, based on pre-war borders. But they've taken a lot of other areas along that Azov Sea coast, the so-called land bridge to Crimea. They've taken the Kherson region, which they still control. And the question in my mind is, do you think they intend to keep it and potentially annex it to Crimea to keep that land bridge and the strategic more of the strategic coast along the Azov and the Black Sea region? Or do you think they'll pull back? And if they decide to keep it, do you think they can actually handle it? We haven't seen, obviously, an insurgency just yet, but there's a lot of Ukrainians in that area still that presumably are pretty anti-Russian, and the Ukrainian government can easily flood more weapons, more javelins, more RPGs into that area to cause Russians a lot of pain. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I suspect that when it comes to Donbass, they might outright annex the territory one way or another. But when it comes to this southern region that, yes, people refer to as a land bridge, although I'll be frank, I'm not a huge fan of that term, that remains very much in question. So not seeing great evidence of the fact that they actually intend to turn these into new people's republics, right? There's not a lot of political organization there. They've removed mayors, Ukrainian mayors, and they seem to be kidnapping people and shipping them somewhere, unclear where. But when it comes to giving air to pro-Russian forces, political activists, and the like, I'm not seeing a lot of that, which leads me to suspect that, as in other cases, they haven't actually decided yet what they want to do. I think their first best strategy is to use these as trading chips, right? To maybe annex Donbass, then try to trade these bits of territory back to Ukraine in exchange for political settlement where they attain some more of the national level demands, right? Like neutrality and whatnot.
That strikes me as a pipe dream, though, Mike, because after the heroic defense of Mariupol, Zelensky this week instituted a hero status to that city. I mean, I just don't see him ever signing a piece of paper that gives it up. That he would be lynched probably if he ever did that. So I'm not sure that they may think that, but I'm not sure it's realistic at all.
Well, I was going to counter and say, what part of this operation doesn't strike you as a pipe dream, starting from the first 3 days?
Fair enough.
Just to be honest, I mean, once people think that they can get into the Ukrainian capital and force a surrender within 72 hours, there's definitely pipe dream territory in terms of planning.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense.
Let's put it this way: if it's a pipe dream, it would be consistent with the other things I've seen so far in this war from the Russian side. But speaking realistically, I think most likely it might end up being a prolonged occupation, right? And they'll come up with some political framework, but it will be costly. I mean, that's hundreds of kilometers worth of new borders. Kherson is not on the southern side of the river, right? The city. It's on the northern side of, or let's say the western side of the Dnieper River. So you don't have a natural boundary there. They'd have to be defended. They'd have to defend it from Mykolaiv. And it will create a pretty large front for them to have to occupy, for them to have to defend a sizable population around that area, not even including Donbass. It would be challenging, I think, for them, and you're not going to get some stable borders there.
And we're already seeing some of that, right? So Chernobyevka, which is this suburb of Kherson, is famous because the Ukrainians have shelled it on several occasions, destroyed a lot of the aircraft, and famously killed the commander of the 49th Combined Arms Army in that region. And in fact, Zelensky in his address the other day, talking about how Defense Minister Shoigu in Russia has been sort of disappeared, if you will, for the last couple of weeks, although he has now reappeared. But Zelensky said, maybe he was visiting Chernobyevka, and that's why he hasn't been seen for some time. Given the Ukrainians' ability to hit it with artillery, and given that it's just on the outskirts of Kherson, that probably doesn't bode well for them in terms of ability to keep it without a lot of losses, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that it would require sustained occupation, and then Kherson could end up being the next Donetsk.
Yeah. Let's talk about the impact of this on Russia, because I did a thread on this a few days ago, or actually yesterday, where I talked about these reduced goals that they've now proclaimed, that Putin has reaffirmed today, of Donbass, quote unquote, liberation of the Donbass. And if you look at the costs that they've suffered, obviously a huge economic costs, huge diplomatic costs that will be decimating the Russian economy for decades, potentially, if they don't get from under those sanctions. But also, I think most importantly, the prestige that Russia has suffered due to its pitiful performance, military performance in this war, right? And you're starting to see some really hawkish elements on Russian television talking about how, pushing back on this notion that we can just take down Donbass and be happy with it, because, I saw one commentator on TV on Vladimir Solovyov's program on Channel 1 Russian television. Solovyov, of course, the famous propagandist, Putin's propagandist. And this person was saying, if you can't handle Ukraine, how can you claim credibly to threaten NATO, to threaten the United States? You're a laughingstock. You couldn't even deal with Zelensky. How can you deal with Biden or Schultz or Macron? And I wanted you to address that, because Russia has become a laughingstock. The famous memes about Ukrainian tractors carting away equipment, the challenges that they're having across most of the axes of advance here. That's a pretty big psychological impact that they must be feeling. And even though information is not getting through as much as it has before to the Russian public, they're still on Telegram. They can still get on VPNs and find this out. Can you comment on that, the psychological impact on Russia from even if they manage to pull off this quote-unquote victory with just taking Donbass?
So I think there's actually two conversations there, Dmitry. The first one is regarding some of the sentiments you heard on that program. And I watched it too, actually. And I thought that the person speaking there about how this would be a very visible defeat for Russia. How could Russia claim to take on NATO or anybody else if they lose so visibly in Ukraine? Essentially, it looked like the reaction from the commentators there to the proposition that Russia could accept anything other than a maximalist victory in Ukraine. That to me is an interesting conversation about what the political mindset and sentiments might be in Russia because of what the Kremlin has unleashed, right? When it comes to political mobilization, once you unleash it, it's going to be very hard to then start and spin a narrative about how this is just about the Donbass. People will realize that it's a defeat and it will have consequences for the regime. That's very obvious. So I think that's one conversation about how all these various individuals within the system and also the general public are likely to interpret something less than a clear victory, which is most likely what they'll have to accept, because I don't really see how Russia can politically win this war. The second conversation is about perceptions of Russia in international community. So there's two things there. First, yeah, Russian performance military-wise is pretty embarrassing. We can see that. And they've not done nearly as well as a lot of people had estimated early on. I think the military analysis community to which I belong had somewhat overestimated Russian military capability and underestimated Ukraine military capability. I have a long thread on that from a couple of weeks ago. I will say that it's a lot more complicated than that. Military power always needs a context to express itself. You can't measure it the way you do accounting. So military power in the abstract is just not a thing. So how Russia does in Ukraine tells us some things about how Russian military would perform and the problems they have with the fundamentals in other contingencies, but it doesn't tell us nearly as much as people think. But that said, yeah, you're right. There's real dismissiveness of Russian military power that I think we're going to be dealing with moving forward. And, in my community, at least, we've for a long time now dealt with two narratives. Either Russia's 12 foot tall or it's 4 foot tall. And the truth has always been somewhere in between. And this is going to be another probably significant overcorrection into the Russia 4 foot tall category, where I can already see I'm going to spend years probably having talk about how the Russian military did poorly in Ukraine. But, that's a snapshot of what happened in this particular war.
I was talking to General Petraeus the other day, who does listen to these podcasts and is a big fan of your analysis, Mike. And he said, given their performance in Ukraine right now, he's not sure that they're even 4 foot tall at this point.
Really?
Given the disastrous impact and the loss of general officers and so forth. Let's talk.
Hold on, Dmitry. Let me ask: Can you ask General Petraeus next time what we should take away from U.S. performance and success in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Come on.
I'm just being asked about how we actually assess military power performance and context, right? Because the way you assess, let's say, likelihood of Chinese military success in a Taiwan Strait scenario is very different from the way you assess a China-India war, right? So there's some things that really matter in terms of context. So a lot of things are generalizable, but not all of them.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about weapon systems. So a lot has been made of the Switchblades drones, the self-destruct kamikaze drones that we're now providing to the Ukrainians. What do you think is the impact of that? Obviously, very cheap to use, easy to use. They crash into a Russian vehicle and detonate on impact. If we're able to flood a lot of those drones into Ukraine, do you think it's going to make a huge difference?
I mean, like any tactical system, I'm sure it'll make an impact. At the end of the day, it's up to Ukrainians to make use of an aggregate to success, and I think they've done a pretty good job. I'm surprised it's actually taken us a while to get into the drone conversation. I thought that we spent quite a bit of time talking about MiG-29s, which didn't make nearly as much sense to me as discussing the subject of providing Soviet-gen air defense systems that other countries had, various remotely operated systems that either we or other allies and partners had that we probably could have gotten into this conflict a long time ago.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you is there's a lot of conversation now, and some of it is even making it into the Pentagon, about tanks and how useful tanks may be in future conflicts, given the success of anti-tank systems like Javelins and MLAWs on the battlefield in Ukraine. I know you have an opinion on this, so I thought it would be useful to get it out there publicly. You do believe that tanks still have a place on future battlefields, right?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I don't own special stock in any tank-making companies, okay? But last time I had to deal with this conversation was in the Nagorno-Karabakh War of 2020, where, again, the same crew of folks came out and said, I think that the tank is sort of like the knight on the battlefield. It's dead. And here's the truth. tanks have always been vulnerable. They've never been invulnerable. Two, if you have a vehicle that has a better combination of firepower, mobility, and protection, I would love to see it. Three, if you'd like to assault on something other than a tank, I'd love to see what that is, because that vehicle has particular missions, right? So if you think something does a better mission set than a tank, if you like to go maybe in urban warfare with a support vehicle that you think does better, okay, great. I'd like to see it. And last but not least, the tank is vulnerable, but it is at least pretty well protected against a lot of the capabilities out there on the battlefield. Everything else is less protected. So I'm not sure why anyone believes that, you'd be better off in some lightly skinned armored combat vehicle relative to a tank. And maybe it's a cost conversation for some militaries. I totally get that. And it can definitely be a force structure decision for some services like the Marine Corps. I also get where they're coming from with their force structure reforms. But I don't buy the story that the tank is dead in the battlefield just because Russia's lost a lot of tanks in this war, or, the Armenians lost a lot of tanks in Azeris and in their war. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Tanks perform an important role, and I've yet to see a counter argument as to what you would put there. The bigger issue is, all right, there's a lot of countries, including our own, that are very far behind on active protection systems for tanks, generations behind relative to the lethality of infantry carried weapons, and tanks need to be properly supported. And there's a lot of militaries that field tanks, but they don't have the effective support for them. For example, protection against drones or various remotely operated systems.
Got it. Let's buy better tanks, but let's not get rid of them. That's fair. So you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh, and we'd be remiss not to talk a little bit about that, because it seems that the Azeris took advantage of everyone's attention on Ukraine right now, and they launched an offensive in the Nagorno-Karabakh against Armenian forces. What do you make of that? It appears that they're pulling back now. Do you think that this is a resumption of conflict there, or was that just a tactical attempt at taking some gains?
My best guess, and I have to be frank, that I'm not tracking that nearly as well because I'm sort of being consumed attention-wise by this war, is that they're likely probing to see what the Russian Armenian reaction would be, and if to gauge whether or not they have an opportunity right now to potentially gain more territory or maybe push Armenians out of the region, while they know that the bulk of Russian military power is preoccupied in Ukraine and not doing very well.
Yeah, and it seems like they've been slapped for that, and they're now pulling back, at least according to the reports. Mike, last question. What are you looking at next? What do you expect to see happening over the next couple of weeks here as this war evolves?
I mean, I think the big question for me is whether or not the Russian military will demonstrate that they are prioritizing the Donbass, in which case we are going to see a shift in their forces. And if they're going to try this sort of last big push, I mean, there's an argument to be made that the Russian forces in Ukraine maybe have one set of offensives in them, right? And if they're going to concentrate somewhere, it will be the Donbass. I'm also going to look to see where Ukrainian military is able to make gains in counterattacks. I mean, they've certainly taken advantage of the loss of Russian momentum, but see if they can actually sustain counterattacks or not, or if these are going to be very sporadic and incremental. And then, the third point would be to look for political signals from Russian leadership themselves about what direction they're going to take in this war. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, has been trying to figure out what does Vladimir Putin actually know and think about this war, right? Because you can easily mirror image, but there isn't clear evidence that he, one, understands the battlefield reality as it is, two, that the Russian military is actually telling him the real state of their forces and the prospect for success, three, appreciates the limits of what any additional military means put into this war could possibly achieve in terms of political aims, right? So it's not clear what his reality looks like, if he appreciates the true state of the Russian military situation on the ground, and that's what's going to shape his decision making, right? Not sort of our objective attempt to analyze the situation.
That is a very fair point, and I've made that point before that we shouldn't mirror image. But I'll tell you, I was actually a little bit impressed with Putin, in the last 2 days, having realized that the takeover of Ukraine is not achievable and pulling back and trying to redefine victory. We're only a month into this war. I mean, if you want to make the comparison with Afghanistan, it took us 20 years to realize we're losing and to make the hard decision to pull out. Here he is a month in, publicly redefining the objectives. Of course, they're claiming that these have always been objectives, but no one seriously is really buying that. But that actually did impress me. That it tells me that he's not disconnected from reality, and he's appreciating what is achievable and what is not. Do you agree with me on this?
I'll split the point with you, which is to say that if that was true, he would not have attempted this war in the first place as a banal, quick regime change operation, where he honestly thought they were going to roll Ukraine and not face much resistance in a few days. So I'll say that maybe we're now seeing inklings of him realizing the reality on the ground, but I'm not quite so sanguine yet. And as always, I'll say that it's a lot easier for someone like Putin in a personalist authoritarian system to revise the political objectives barely a few weeks into a war and then start putting out a narrative that, oh, it was just about the Donbass in the first place, right? That's one of the big advantages of that system for an authoritarian leader.
Sure, it's easier, but it's not easy, as we're seeing with the pushback that he's getting even from his core propagandists and television that want to keep pushing and taking all of Ukraine. And I'll say this, I completely agree with you. He massively miscalculated on the Ukrainian resistance, on ability to take Kiev, on economic sanctions, no doubt. But it seems like he's realizing that he's miscalculated, and he's realizing what may or may not be achievable. But that remains to be seen. Well, another great conversation. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you, Chris, for joining us, for sharing your thoughts with us. Always insightful. And Mike, you've been right in terms of predictions of how this war would unfold pretty much since day one. So always recommend everyone listen to you for what's to come because you have a very keen understanding of the Russian military and what's taking place on the ground, unlike pretty much anyone else in this field. So again, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your weekend, and hopefully we'll see each other soon again. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.